Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Rosella Garcia, and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Relations here at Teachers College. And I am very excited that you're all joining us here today for our latest webinar on learning agility that will feature Professor Emeritus Burke and TC alum David Hoff. And before we begin, I'd like to quickly remind you of some of the ways that you can stay involved as a TC alum. You can always hire TC alumni and students to work with you at your organization. You can refer wonderful prospective students to join us here at Teachers College. I encourage you to show your Teachers College pride by putting Teachers College Columbia University in all of your professional credentials, including your LinkedIn profile. And I invite you to share your own expertise and knowledge with us by joining the TC Alumni Association or by submitting a proposal to host your own webinar in the future. And when the time is right for you, I hope you do consider supporting Teachers College financially. By sharing their time and expertise, our TC alumni and faculty are able to make this series possible, and we're very grateful to them for sharing their knowledge with the greater TC community. As I mentioned, today I have the honor of sharing the airwaves with Professor Emeritus Burke and TC alum David Hoff. And I'm so excited that these experts in learning agility will be sharing all of their knowledge with us today. So Warner usually needs no introduction among a Teachers College crowd, but for those of you newcomers or guests that are joining us today, I hope you'll indulge me. Warner has been a thought leader in organizational psychology and a professor at Teachers College since the late 70s. Beyond the academy, Professor Burke's consulting experience has been with a variety of organizations in business industry, education, government, religious, and medical systems. He's received numerous awards, including the Public Service Medal from NASA, and in 2003, both the Distinguished Scholar Practitioner Award from the Academy of Management and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the OD Network. Most recently, he's received the Outstanding Civilian Service Medal from the Department of the Army. He has authored over 200 articles and book chapters, and also authored and co-authored or edited 22 books. And today we're joined by one of his co-authors, TC alum David Hoff. Dave is the COO and EVP of Leadership Development for Easy Consult, and they work with Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and mid-sized corporations to provide customized talent management solutions. Easy Consult specialties include leadership assessment, online pre-employment assessment, survey research, competency modeling, leadership development, executive coaching, 360 feedback, online structured interviews, and EEO hiring advisement. After leaving TC, Dave built his illustrious 40-year-plus career in organization development management and training, human resource development, and international human resources. In 2003, he became a principal at Easy Consult. And in the last few years, he's worked to develop the suite of Burke assessments, the Burke certification program, and has authored articles on learning agility and helped to promote this book, or these books, I should say. And I've had the personal pleasure of working with Dave and benefiting from his organizational development skills through his years of service to TC's Alumni Council. So thank you both and welcome. Everyone here has a certain expectation of what they're going to learn today. And I know, Dave, we were talking about your very first day at Teachers College and a sort of transformative learning moment that you had. And I thought that might be a great way to tee us off. So do you want to tell that story to us?
As I was thinking about the things that we were going to be talking about today, I had to think back to my first day at TC, and I remember us being in a big room, and that I assumed that we had to introduce ourselves. But the part that I remembered was each of the faculty members standing up, introducing themselves, talking about their academic credentials, their areas of expertise. And then they said to us, "So tell us what you want to learn." And my reaction was, what do you mean? I'm paying a lot of money to go to Columbia, and you're supposed to tell me what I'm supposed to learn. And, so as I think about it now, how foolish it was. And as we begin to talk about learning agility, one of the dimensions is reflecting. So I was doing some reflecting as it relates to my time at Columbia. The other thing that I thought about was, and we'll get into this more later, the context, the effect of context on learning agility. So, I was a product of an educational system for 17 years, and it was the teacher tells you when the test will be and when the papers due, and so on and so forth. So now I'm in a different situation where they're saying, hey, tell us what you want to learn. And it just took a while for me to adjust. So that's me telling a story on myself.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing. And I think, it's certainly a part in all of our learning process of how we continue to evolve and how we learn to be learning agile. So we are all eager to dive into that, but I'm also curious if we could sort of set the stage on how the two of you became our dynamic duo in terms of sharing with the greater community more about learning agility. And I must admit, I always assumed Dave was a former student of Warner's, and I recently learned that is not the case. So could you elaborate just how it is that you two came to know each other and to work together?
I'll start, and then Warner can correct me. I guess it was the mid 80s, and I was at Anheuser-Busch, and I got invited to a dinner at the American Society of Training and Development, a board meeting or something, and the person that was sitting next to me was a guy named Warner Burke. And so over the course of the dinner, we started talking and realized, oh, so you went to Columbia, you're at Columbia. As it turns out, Warner had come in and taken over the department that had previously been there. So it was called Applied Human Development, and he came in and took it over as organizational psychology, I think. And so that was the start of our relationship, and we continued to stay in touch. And then about 10 years ago, it got more intense as we really began to dig into this thing called learning agility.
I think that the other thing to add is that I was intrigued by this new buzzword that was going around called agility. And it's sort of like, we are a country that's loaded with buzzwords or things like that. So if it's not agility, it'll be something else, that's for sure. And in fact, today, agility is about 10 years old. So if you're using it, you're a little bit late. But what is new, so there's no such thing as just leadership anymore. So the new version of leadership is nimble. So now you use the word nimble leadership. And that means flexibility, and it could come close to agility. Imagine that. So anyway, agility was one of those buzzwords about a decade ago. And I got intrigued with it and talked to Dave about what he understood about it and so forth. So we began to talk about the possibility of my doctoral students and I getting interested in trying to find a way to measure it. And that's what happened. And so I owe a lot to a lot of doctoral students that have worked with me over the years to develop what we have today. But it's taken that long to have something that we can really rely on and depend on and be proud of, as a matter of fact. And that's the measurement of learning agility.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. And thank you for doing that work and including your students in that work and TC alumni to help bring all of those resources to us so that we can continue to grow as professionals and as lifelong learners. So thank you very much. We mentioned that Warner, or if you didn't grab that, I guess I sort of glazed over all his time in the academy. But if you don't know, Warner is rooted in the research side of things. And as you just heard, he brought in his students to really focus on researching learning agility. And Dave has spent his career in practice and in helping to bring these skills, to light at organizations all over the world. So I imagine if I asked you each to define learning agility, which I know, Warner, you started a little bit there, but you might have different answers on what that is that you would say. So could you each tell us how you define learning agility? And Warner, you might, start us off and round out what you were just sort of sharing, and then Dave, you can jump in.
Good.
I think that the main thing for me about getting involved in research about learning agility was the fact that to select people these days, it is a very, very difficult task. So selection of new employees is hard work. And where we've come is everybody is overly specialized. So what is the main sort of categories or aspects of one's life and personality and so forth that you want to concentrate on? It's all over the place. So settling down on what is the main factors that you're looking for when you select people is very difficult today. So it seemed to me that if, when in doubt, seek a person who's high on learning agility, because they can learn what they need to know and learn it fast. So that's what really motivated me to get going even more quickly on trying to figure out a way to measure this, because I thought it would really make a contribution in terms of selection. And that it makes a contribution in terms of development too, as Dave can respond, because the second book that we have done that's what it's all about, is developing learning agility. So the two concepts that we really want to be clear about is selection and development with respect to how to use a measure of learning agility. It was clear to me that from the literature, and there wasn't much literature on this 10 years ago, but the literature that did exist was concentrating on two concepts called flexibility and speed. And that seemed to be central to everything that was agile, was those two notions. So if you can be flexible and exercise your flexibility in a fast way, you're likely to be ahead of the game in terms of learning. So that's where we went in terms of trying to understand at the beginning what learning agility was all about. But it became more and more complicated. So flexibility and speed became two dimensions out of a group of 9. So it became far more complicated than the way we started, which made the work much more fascinating for me. And the more complicated it was, the better I liked it. But of course, the more difficult it is to measure. So when it's difficult, it's hard to measure. But we've worked on it long enough that I think we've got a good measurement device, and Dave can respond to that as well.
Sure. Thanks, Werner. The thing I would say is that it's always been important to me, from my time at Columbia to my work at Easy Consult, that any of the assessments that I use are based in theory. So there's research behind it, that it's not just somebody's idea of what learning agility is. So I've heard Warner in different situations use a variation of the definition that's up on the slide on the left. Now, again, as Rosella said, I'm the practitioner. I'm the guy that works with operations people or salespeople. And if I were to kind of give them a more academic definition, they would say, could you tell me that in English? So, I've worked that down so that as simple as I can make it and still have it say something is learning agility is you find yourself in a situation where you've never been before. You don't know what to do and you figure it out. And, as Warner said, the one thing that's constant is change. And as we're trying to figure out how to assess people, what that consists of changes. But one thing that we think is pretty constant is this ability to go into a new situation and use a set of things that we'll talk about today and figure it out.
we've kind of alluded to it, but I think it might be worth sharing a little bit more about why it's important for us to know if I'm, for example, learning Agile, if my team is learning Agile, what is important about measuring learning agility and focusing on improving it.
Again, to repeat myself about the importance of selection. So why that is so important is because the world is moving much faster than it used to. Or it's certainly true for me. It feels that way. So everything is fast. And so unless you're going to be on the same treadmill with respect to speed, you're not going to be catching up very fast or very adequately. So that's a big part of it. I think the other is, and here we go with boredom about practice, but we got to have a theory behind all this. As an academic, I think it's extremely important. And there are three things that guided the work to determine these items in the first place. And those three theories were sensitivity training, or T groups, that started back in the 1950s, actually in 1947 to be exact. So that's one of the theory bases. The second one is behaviorism. And behaviorism is like B.F. Skinner. So if you got a white rat or a pigeon in a cage and you give them a behavioral act to do, and when they do it, you feed them, they'll tend to repeat it. So if we can get a way for people to try some things out with respect to their behavior and get rewarded for doing that, they're likely to repeat it. And getting rewarded for doing that is doing well on the learning agility questionnaire. The third and final theoretical background has to do with reflection and what Arger's called double loop learning, or he and Don Schoen did. But it has to do with what Dave said a few minutes ago, thinking about what you had just experienced and not quite understanding it, and thinking it through can help with developing that understanding. Anyway, that's enough lecture on theory, but I had to get the theory in, for God's sake.
I appreciate it. That's why we're here.
I'm representing the whole academic world. Dave is representing the entire practice world. So.
Absolutely.
When I talk to groups of senior leaders in organizations, I give them this definition, and I say, then I go on to say, so people who are more learning agile are better able to solve more problems in more situations more often. And if that's not important to you, we should talk about the next subject. And I've yet to have someone say next subject. Okay, so that's the so what. Then in our next slide, and it really kind of relates to what Warner was saying about the theory behind it. The next thing that I say when I'm working with a group of people is the smartest person in the room the most learning agile? Okay, and Warner, I'm going to hand that back over to you.
Do you have to be halfway smart to score well on learning agility? The answer is yes, but let's be clear about it. Think about the concept of creativity. Here's what the research says about a creative person. A creative person usually has an average level, at least, of intelligence, maybe a little above average. But after that, there's no correlation between intelligence and creativity. So in other words, a creative person is one who has a certain amount of necessary intelligence, but is not necessarily brilliant, because after a certain level, the correlation drops, and there's hardly a correlation at all. I think the same is true for learning agility. I believe to be, and I haven't been able to document this yet, but at some point we will. What learning agility is about is having enough intelligence to be a well-informed individual and operate with others in an effective way, but not brilliant. So in other words, you've got to have a certain amount of intelligence. Beyond that certain amount, it doesn't matter. So I don't think there's a correlation between brilliance and learning agility. I think a brilliant person is possible to be rigid as hell. And they have learned all they're going to learn in life. But a person who's average in intelligence and agile about learning more has got a better chance at increasing one's ability to learn.
Now, the thing that I would add to that, Warner, is, and we've talked about this many times, that we'd love an opportunity to study both learning agility and emotional intelligence, because there's probably a number of connections between someone's emotional intelligence or awareness of how they show up and their ability to be successful in unfamiliar situations.
Chapter in our second book does show that there's a relationship between certain aspects of emotional intelligence, like open to new experiences. That's a concept that's there, and there's a strong correlation between that concept and learning agility. So some preliminary validity studies do indeed show that.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm just noticing, of course, we're taking Q&A at the end of the program. And so if you haven't yet used the Q&A pane to do so, please do that. One just popped in and it really relates perfectly to this. So I'll just kind of throw it out there. And Warner, you said if someone is brilliant, they could be rigid as, I think you said rigid as hell. So I'll just say it right back to you. But can high intelligence get in the way of learning agility?
That'd be an interesting study in itself right there. But I certainly believe that it can.
You know,
just making more work for you guys.
Well, I would say I have an N of one that says yes. There was a very bright guy that I was working with a couple of years ago, and by how would I measure bright? PhD and an MD. And he took the learning agility inventory and rated himself at the 99th percentile. His supervisor didn't share that perspective. And then I asked him how do you reconcile those things? And, you know, at the end of the day, it was, he didn't collaborate with his peers or anyone, or he didn't seek feedback because he didn't value them. They weren't as smart as him. So in that sense, his native intelligence was getting in the way of his effectiveness. So anyway, we might want to jump into the 9 dimensions.
Warner referenced those just briefly earlier, but it might be a good way to, move in for those that aren't as familiar with the concepts and the dimensions of learning agility to take a look. So I'll bring these up here and y'all can maybe walk us through them.
Let me just say right at the outset, and then you take over, Dave, that these dimensions emerged from our understanding of the theory behind all of this. Those 3 categories of theory. This is largely where these dimensions came from.
The only thing that I would say, we've got an asterisk next to flexibility and speed, because when Warner and his doctoral students started studying it, they identified the work of DeRue at the University of Michigan, and their work said learning agility is 2 things. It's speed and flexibility, which Warner and his students confirmed, and then went on to come up with 7 other things. So experimenting is, we, for the purposes of today, let's keep it at a high level. Experimenting is what it sounds like. So you're trying out different things, but you have a plan ahead of time, which is different than the next one, which is performance risk taking, where you're really just jumping into a situation and seeing how it goes. Interpersonal risk taking, you are asking other people, you're taking risks with other people, to admitting mistakes, asking for help, taking a contrary point of view in a meeting. Then collaborating is pretty much what it sounds like. Are you building networks and connecting with other people and using those connections to move your learning agility agenda along? Information gathering, it's using a bunch of resources to learn more about subjects that you're trying to get more competent in. Feedback seeking, Again, straightforward. It's asking bosses, peers, others, how am I doing, or how did I do, and then reflecting. And Warner's talked about it. It's stepping back and trying to learn from what happened, so that you can do something different going forward.
Let me just add on to that. We had a mayor of New York City by the name of Koch a number of years ago. And he would get on a subway and he would yell at the people on the subway and ask, "How am I doing?" as mayor. And he became known as the guy who was constantly asking New Yorkers how he was doing. That's called feedback seeking. As funny as that might seem, that's what he was doing. And so out of the 9 dimensions, that's the lowest scoring one. We do not ask people for feedback. I don't know how we're going to learn if we don't. So a word to the wise here.
And the other thing in terms of feedback seeking is in my work in Asia, that's one of the ones that folks score lowest on. And I did a bunch of work in Japan, and there's that saying that the nail that stands up must be hammered down. So people are natural, so we talk about the context in the organization. So with some of the folks that I've worked with, I've said, well, you don't have to stand up and say, how did I do on that project? You could say, how did we do? Now, you were the leader of the project. They said, yeah, you can do that. So it's kind of interesting. Culturally, feedback seeking is the only one that I've seen kind of play out a little bit differently in different parts of the world.
So now we know how we, what it is. And so now we should talk about how we measure this. And I know there's, perhaps another service out there, but we know that the Burke assessment is rooted in theory, as Werner said. It was developed with your doctoral students to really make it a superior research-grounded assessment tool. But maybe you could share with us how learning agility is assessed.
I don't want to bore people with respect to all the research behind this. But in any case, you have 2 dimensions of research you've got to cover. One is reliability and the other is validity. Reliability means, does it measure over time what you say it measures consistently? So does the same person get the same score over time, or relatively the same score? You want that score to go up, of course, but if they don't do anything with respect to the data that they got on themselves, then they're not likely to change their score. And validity means the extent to which it measures what it ought to measure, like what Dave was saying earlier, aspects of emotional intelligence. Would make a lot of sense to seek out research studies that do that. So those are the ways to think about it. The second comment I want to make about the research on it, the assessment aspect, these are behavioral statements that people are rating themselves on a 7-point scale. And so do you do this or do you not do this? So it's to what extent do you? And you see on the screen the 7-point scale. But it's about behavior. So one of the fascinating things about this measure is that for each item, it comes fairly close to a normal distribution in terms of people's scores. So in other words, there's a lot of variance on all of these items in terms of how people score. Rather than the typical kind of research on it, it shows that people rate themselves higher than other people rate them. And that's not necessarily true with our measure.
A lot of times when I'm talking to a prospective customer about this, and we haven't really specified yet that there's 3 versions of the assessment. So we're talking now about the self-report, and invariably it comes up in the conversation that, wait a second, a self-report, how do you know that people aren't going to inflate their ratings? And early on, we did not know that. But now we've collected thousands of responses. And when you look at the data, it comes out scarily like a normal distribution. And what that says is people are not inflating their ratings. So then the conversation that Warner and I had is, why is that? Well, if you look at the stem that's used in each of the items, it's how often you engage in the following behaviors, not how well do you do this. I think if we said, how well do you do this, then people would have inflated their ratings. And if you think about what things you do often, well, more likely it's things that you do well. So we're able to kind of, trick's not the right word, but get at what we're trying to get at without them inflating the ratings.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, we talked a little bit about the assessment, and you sort of alluded to it here. You're sort of given an overall score, and then the self-report really digs into how you sort of stack up against each of the specific 9 dimensions, right? So I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on any of these, or if we just want to keep the conversation moving forward and kind of come back to it as questions come up.
Yeah, well, so let me just say quickly. So now each of the reports, each of the assessments has a different report. So this is part of the report for the self version. So it starts out with an overall score. In this case, the person scored at the 42nd percentile overall average score. Then the next page in their report would go into the profile by dimension. So you see, no, go back to that previous slide. So then the page would say, here's a profile by dimension. And in this case, the person had a number of dimensions they scored high on: experimenting, interpersonal risk-taking, collaborating, reflecting. And a couple of the lower ones are speed, performance risk-taking, and information gathering. Okay, so now we've got a picture at the dimension level. So then the next slide, there is a page for each of the 9 dimensions. So in this case, we're showing the dimension of flexibility, which the person scored at the 46th percentile, which puts them in the average range. And for each of the pages, there is a paragraph that talks about how they showed up at the 46th percentile. And then each of the bullets down below, those connect to the specific items. So we said there's 5 questions for flexibility. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. So first bullet, you offer proposed solutions that are innovative. Your input helps others in their efforts to solve problems. People will seek you out as a resource on teams and projects, and then it gives them some other things they can do. Second thing, describing differences that exist among points of view is an ability you sometimes display. And the encouragement there is you need to do it more often if you want to get higher on that. So that's a couple of examples of the self. Next slide is just the first page of the Burke 360. So what you have here are, you saw that the profile by dimension 2 slides ago. Now you've got it here, but it's displayed as what we call a spider diagram. And the green figure is every other person that rated this person, and the blue is themselves. So what we tell them they need to think about, talk about, is differences between their score and the sum of the other scores of greater than 1 point. And so if you look at it quickly, there's like 6 areas: reflecting, feedback seeking, information gathering, collaborating, performance, risk-taking, and experimenting. So a lot of stuff. And then we take it down to the item level and item by the person that rated them. So there's a ton of data when you're using the 360 version.
And I know we've talked, a little bit, and maybe not as specifically, right? Like, so organizations could be having all of their members of the team taking the assessment, or certainly an individual could seek out the assessment, and if they're just curious about doing some personal professional development, the resources are available on your site. And also, of course, you can sort of guide yourself through these journeys by perusing one of the 2 books or both. But certainly, you mentioned a couple of the the dimensions that stand out. And also, you're going to have a different score. So if you have I guess, are there certain dimensions that you want to score highly on or to improve yourself? Are there things among the dimensions that are going to make you a more learning, agile individual?
That's a good question, Rosella. Let me respond to it initially, and then Dave, you can follow up.
Sure.
Our measure of learning agility does not actually measure learning agility. So let me be clear. What we're measuring are the behaviors that will get you to be agile, not agile itself. So that's why we've emphasized that it measures, we're asking you behavioral questions. Do you do this or do you not? And what are the two most important ones? Probably flexibility and speed. Or in any case, they're the grounding dimensions out of the 9. That would be the way I would try to express what the measure is actually measuring. It's measuring the behaviors that will get you to be agile, not agileness per se.
Yeah. So to add to what you said, Warner, and you and I talked about this last week. If the question was, what are the most difficult dimensions to develop? My answer to that question would be flexibility, because in part you're asking the person to be able to change the paradigm with which they see things, and that is really hard, at least from my perspective. And then I think performance risk taking. So and we talk about it in this the recent book. And I think in order for people to make progress there, they've got to use a common yardstick. So we're looking at the same situation using the same ruler, and then at that point we can begin to adjust up or down. That's hard, right? So that's performance risk taking, and then interpersonal risk taking. Being able to stick your neck out and feedback seeking, and I saw a question that came up about feedback seeking, and in the book, the recent book, I talk about feedback seeking, and it's a two-way street, right? I could go in to Warner as my boss and say, "Hey, Warner, I'd like some feedback," and if he's a crappy feedback giver, well, I'm probably not going to get a lot. So it's almost like you got to work on both sides of the equation there in order for somebody to really obtain and then hopefully utilize effective feedback.
We've talked about developing learning agility. I'm almost wondering too, is it something that you need to maintain, right? We've talked about you're practicing certain behaviors to achieve your sort of higher scored learning agility. But if you're sort of comfortable with where you are on your score, is there something you need to be doing to maintain a certain level of learning agility?
One of the things that we also talk about is motivation, right? So it probably says something about me. There are people that I was giving feedback to, and I'd see their overall score and it was low, and I was feeling bad for them. And then more often than not, we begin to talk about it, and they'd say, "No, that's accurate. That's me," and they were okay with it. Well, I mean, it's not that learning agility is good or bad, and if it's not important to you, then there's probably other things in your life that are, and good luck with it. But our thing is learning agility. Warner, you want to answer Rosella's question more directly?
Well, yes, more directly is the right adjective is an adverb, and that is, if in this day and age when things are moving so fast and changing so much, if you don't keep up, you're going to be out of the ball game rather quickly. By the second or third inning, you're out.
Well,
I'm sort of looking forward to the baseball season.
I think it's a journey, not a destination. So the only thing that we're promised is things going to be different tomorrow than they are today.
Yeah.
And, how honed are your skills or your abilities to deal with those new situations?
And just to reinforce the motivation part too that Dave was saying, and if you're not motivated, well, you're not going to do very much to try to improve your agility and nimbleness with respect to learning situations. If you just don't give a damn, forget about it. It's not going to happen. So motivation really is important. And then you're developing the skills. So it's motivation and skills. So you got to have both to be agile.
One last thing I would say about the slide that's up here. So this is the focus of the second book and an overview of what's in it. The first book just focuses on the self-report version of learning agility. So we didn't talk about the 180 and 360 because they didn't exist. So that's where we start in the second book, is looking at the pluses and minuses of each of the different variations. And a lot of times people will ask me, well, what does it look like in real life? And if it's too close to home, people get in their own way. So I was actually out fishing with a captain in Wilmington, and he started talking to me about his work, and I couldn't help but begin to hear learning agility coming out. So I interviewed him, and that's a chapter in the book, and then I coded it so people can say, here's what this particular behavior looks like with that behavior. And then the next chapter, which is an extensive chapter, one has already talked about a review of the history of organization development and how learning agility fits into that. And then a significant part of the book, it has chapters on each of the 9 dimensions and each of the 38 items under those behaviors and strategies for how you can develop each of those things.
So I think this is probably a good time to open up the floor for some Q&A from the audience. This question came up a little bit earlier, and so we've talked about it a little bit. And but I think maybe we could just, if there's anything missing from how can learning agility be developed among adults? Is there anything else you might add to what we've already sort of talked about here?
Well, you got to be curious about things. And an adult can be just as curious as a 2-year-old. And in fact, what you might want to think about is developing your curiosity is like trying to be a child again, and be curious and to be interested in a lot of things that you are new to you and so forth. But if you don't have that kind of desire to want to find out about something or to learn more about something, you're not likely to do it. So curiosity is really important. Now, I work crossword puzzles. Do they help me? I don't really know. I know that with respect to the New York Times crossword puzzle, I'm an idiot. So it takes
Most of us are, Warner.
But in any case, I try and find it fun to try. So if you don't find things like that enjoyable and a way to sort of think about yourself in different ways, you're not likely to learn very much. So find out what makes learning for you interesting and exciting and motivating. Likely to do it.
I would add to what you just said. A lot of times when we talk with people about developing some aspect of learning agility, you have to understand that you're not going to be successful the first time out, and probably not the second time, and maybe not the third time. And you may look foolish in those early attempts, but there's that curiosity, that drive to learn that thing that is important to becoming more learning agile.
Right.
It also makes me wonder, and I think this is maybe for a future interdisciplinary, piece of research, is can we start introducing this concept to school-age children, right? Like K-12 or even earlier, to really develop this. I'd love to hear their take on it. But that's really great.
Well, to help children follow their curiosity.
Absolutely. Step one.
Facilitate their doing that is a mark of a good teacher.
Let's see. Should we be using this as sort of preparing the workforce? Are these skills and concepts we should be introducing at the higher ed level? Have we done any research of introducing the concepts of learning agility into colleges yet?
The answer to that question is a little bit. But higher education people don't let you do interviews with them very much. By higher education people, I mean presidents of universities and colleges and so forth. Although we know about one study, a qualitative study that was done about this, and higher education executives are very much oriented toward learning agility, as it turns out. They talk about it. They seem to understand it. Do they want to answer questions for themselves and fill out a questionnaire about rating themselves? Not so frequently, but they know what we're talking about and they believe in it is the answer to about the best answer I can give to that segment of our society.
Well, we've also had a couple conversations with a couple folks in Spain at one of the universities there, and they're talking about using this to assess students and then try and measure progress over time. But that's an early discussion.
We'll stay tuned.
Yeah.
We have a question here about how does the organization's culture come into play? Like, for example, performance risk taking. Should the individual also be considering the culture within their within where they're working? Sorry about that.
Absolutely. That's what I said right at the beginning. Context matters, right? So you could have a person with all kinds of curiosity that's in an environment that is high in conformity and punishes you for making mistakes. That's really not going to support becoming more learning agile. Warner?
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
If you don't have a culture, and culture is the context within which we're talking about learning agility. So that's the two most important aspects of understanding behavior is context and the person.
Yeah.
Person in context. That's Kurt Lewin is the father of that kind of thinking. So indeed, that is the case.
And I imagine
If you
that
don't have a culture, if you don't have a culture that permits failure, you're likely not to be very successful in the long run. Now, I'm not talking about 10 times in a row. Maybe that person ought to go. But a failure or two along the way should be quite acceptable in any kind of organization culture.
Well, and now we're back to reflecting, because part of that experience should be talking about, okay, what did you do well? What didn't you do well? What did you learn from that? What are you going to do different the next time, right? It's not just throw the person out there and have them screw it up multiple times in a row.
Yeah, you might want to find another place for them to go.
Yeah.
We talked about context and how that matters, and I imagine that would include personal and global stressors. So there's a question, and it may be too early to tell. Do we know if these global events like this pandemic that we're coming out of, have they affected learning agility? I know so many organizations have, were forced to turn on a dime. Has there been any work done to sort of see the impact of COVID on the learning agility?
No, it's. I read an article a couple of months ago that talked about a group of CEOs that had been interviewed, and they said when they were faced with the pandemic and they had to close their offices in 24 hours, they said in the past we would have had a task force that was meeting for 6 months, and at the end of that they would probably have recommended not to do it, right? And so here you are, you don't have a choice, pick one. So Warner?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that.
Fair enough.
I think But the reason why is I think it's too early for us to understand how the pandemic has affected work life. I mean, we've got people writing op-ed pages like crazy about all this. It's too early. We don't know. Do we need to know? Absolutely. Do we need to start doing research? Yes. But these are early days, and it's so damn complicated that it's just hard to predict.
That's fair. So we'll stay tuned for research to come from the Burke team. I have an interesting question here about, have you done any work on correlating the 9 dimensions to success or to successful performance in a job? So how does, being highly scored on the learning agility assessment correlate with job performance and the success rate there?
So want to talk about the 3 criterion validity studies.
Which one? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
Either one of them. So talk about the hedge fund managers, talk about the healthcare executives, talk about consumer products companies.
Oh, yeah. That's the first one was the hedge fund managers. Yeah, and that was a strong relationship between learning agility and performance. I was just sitting here kind of dumbfounded because we got adequate evidence on this. We really do. It measures something that really contributes to performance. There's just no question about it. Why I was also sort of pausing about it is there's always an argument about what is performance. And I have an answer for that question. And the answer is whatever the client says it is. So in other words, whatever the organization you're working with says is performance, for me, that's performance.
Except performance appraisals.
Except for, yeah, exactly.
So we discussed a little bit about the importance of reflecting and briefly, throughout the conversation, we've talked about feedback seeking. And obviously, Mayor Koch had one way of seeking feedback, but are there specific ways that feedback seeking behaviors should be approached, should be considered? Is there more that you can share on that particular dimension?
Well, I think it's important to have a colleague or two that you really do trust. And if you ask them, they'll tell you the truth. And ask them, 2 or 3 people that are like that in your life. I hope you got at least one person like that in your life that you can ask that kind of question. But if you don't ask the other person, the question you're never going to learn because you can't answer the question yourself. Well, you can, but it's not going to likely be very, very accurate.
Or helpful, yeah.
There's no collaboration there, perhaps.
Yeah.
All right, so maybe we'll make this our last question. We're nearing the top of the hour, or the bottom of the hour, I guess. But do we have any advice on how someone could promote learning agility within their own hierarchical organizations who tend to sort of be slower to evolve? Is there any advice on how someone can encourage their colleagues and managers to start looking at learning agility?
Yeah, let me take a crack at this one, and then you can come in, because I said in the first book that one of the things that was attractive to me about learning agility was, as opposed to other movements that I'd seen, like continuous improvement and that kind of thing, that had to be the whole organization and they had to be all in, and they failed just because of the size of the change you're talking about. So for me, learning agility, you can start with an individual, you can start with a team, you can start with a department, and then you can, I tell people, don't start with the whole organization. Get some experiments going and then use the results of that to leverage to go to a larger group. Warner?
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, you don't start a meeting like that by talking about, let's talk about learning agility. No, you start a meeting like that by saying, how can we improve performance? And learning agility can then come into the conversation in terms of how it can contribute to improving performance. But don't start with learning agility. It's too popular or the topic of the day or anything. And it's like doing something for the sake of doing it. You start with what is tried and true. How can we improve performance at the team level, at the intergroup level, and so on and so forth? So what you were saying. But don't start with learning ability, start with performance. That gets managers' attention.
Avoid the buzzwords. Well,
Exactly.
I want to
avoid buzzwords.
exactly. I want to thank you both so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions that came in, but I'm so excited to see that there was so much interest in this topic. Certainly, there's still a lot to be read. So I encourage you to find the link that we'll share and we've shared in the chat to learn more about learning agility. And we'll be sending out links to those in the email as well. And I thank you all for this really wonderful experience and hope you'll stay tuned for what comes next from Alumni Relations. This is actually my last day at Teachers College, and it has been a true pleasure to work among such wonderful, esteemed faculty and such amazing and supportive alumni. So thank you all for everything that you've done, and I hope you'll continue to support Teachers College just as I will as a fellow alumna. So thank you all for joining us and have a great day. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Werner.